My name is Nyambura Mundia. I am the founding director of Usawa Inc. and the lead convener of Swaiba and Women Leaders Hangouts. We are pleased to be featuring Miss Wambui Kiama, and I will read her bio, which is extensive and vast, so that we get to know Wambui more. So Wambui is passionate about law and in addressing social injustices that especially affect adolescent girls and women globally. She holds a Bachelor of Laws degree from University of London and is an advocate of the High Court of Kenya. She undertook her articles at Triple O Advocates and previously served as a grant manager at the Nike Foundation, supporting the Girl Effect movement in Portland, Oregon, and as a program manager at Akili Dada, which is a leadership incubator for girls and women in Kenya. Wambui is also an alumnus of the Moremi 2010, Vital Voices 2013, Atlas Corps 2014, and Women Leaders of the World 2019 fellowship programs. She currently works as the director of programs at She's the First, a global organization that has presence in 21 countries and 5 regions. Wambui currently sits on the board of Make Every Woman Count and previously on AMREF's Youth in Action movements in Agro's steering committee. She has served in other various capacities and as the coordinating ambassador of the One Young World 2018 and as the African and Europe representative of the Commonwealth Students Association in 2017. Wambui, it is a pleasure to have you. And I must say that this is the highlight of our relationship. And so thank you for coming. You and I have a relationship, and the relationship comes into in light of our perspective in terms of feminist leadership. And I think one of the things that I love is that one, we like to base our conversation on stats. And today, before we met, I was reading an article by KPMG, and there was a statistic that said that out of 10, 6 women do not see themselves as leaders. And that's a huge number because it's over 50%, and women are, half of the world's population. So I am excited about today's conversation because I want us to look at, one, the stats, but also the personal leadership conversation that has led you to an amazing resume as you have. So the question I would want to first hear from you is, if you have stats for us, let us hear why this conversation in feminist leadership is very important.
Wow. First of all, thank you, Nyambura, for having me. I'm really excited. As you mentioned, we go quite a way back, especially in different spaces that we've been able to interact. And I'm really excited and really, really proud of you for the work that you're doing, especially even just having these conversations, because I think having conversations is usually the most easiest thing that we should do, especially when you're talking about feminist leadership and especially how to impact girls and women. You correctly mentioned that, when you ask girls, especially teenage girls, or even just women, if you go into a room and you ask women to write who are the leaders that they aspire to or who have done groundbreaking work, you'll be really sad to notice that very few people will mention a woman.
That's true.
And it's even more sad that very few people will mention themselves as a leader. True. So I think it also depends on what we define leadership as, because we have this very exterior view of what we think leadership is. It's about other people. Yeah. It's very removed from ourselves. But, when you think about various leadership theories, if you can't first govern yourself, you don't have direction, then it's very hard to even, assume other people can have that role in your life. So I do think it's really important to really unpack where we get those socialization. And especially when you think about girls and women in the home setting, you will see if you grow up, especially in the rural setting, women and girls are taking leadership roles, deciding very mundane things that we think about right now, like what we're going to eat, who's going to divide and conquer, the cleaning versus going to fetch firewood. All those are attributes of leadership. But I think it's also depends on how we perceive leadership, because leadership especially has been thought as a very outward facing role, which again, because of how we're socialized, most women and girls don't necessarily want to be in the public speaking, but we grew up doing this. So I think we really need to unpack what leadership is. We also need to first recognize that we are leaders of ourselves. We need to have this conversation, especially with girls and women, because sometimes a lot of our choices in our lives are not made by ourselves and they impact us. When you think about adolescent girls, especially in the global south.
Mm.
You know, they say every 2 seconds a girl is getting married under 18 because of and half of these things about child marriage are really never the girl's decision. It's the societal's expectation that she has to get married or going through FGM. So it's really important that we really take leadership, like to unpack what it is and to make sure girls and women have choice to be able to self-govern and to make decisions for themselves. Remember in high school, especially, even the choices of the subjects you took.
That is true. That is true.
Half of my classmates made that decision themselves. Their parents had a very clear goal that you're going to go to med school, you're going to go to law school, these are the subjects you need to have. I think it's important that we give girls and women agency to self-determine so that then we can have those conversations.
I'm glad the last word you used is agency, because I think as Swaiba, one of the things that we are hoping to bring out is, how can women expand choice and agency for themselves. But as you and I speak, we know it's not as easy, especially for the girls and for the girls themselves. Like it's easy for we who are in the field of gender equality and have the terms to describe it, say it aloud. But then I also know that one of the things that you said is socialization. And I think how you grow and your background does set you up for how further you can see. And I think one of the stories that I like that is common between us is that we came from backgrounds that enabled girls to be themselves, and coming from our matriarchs. That's our grandmother. You and I share grandmothers that were in the struggle. My grandmother was a spy and your grandmother was. It would be nice to hear that story because it's one of my favorite stories between you and I.
When we think about how we're socialized, I really, why I got into this space, especially about advocating for girls and women, is when I went to high school. I thought everyone grew up the way we did. I grew up with very, very strong women. As you mentioned, my grandmother was a freedom fighter. My other grandmother in the 60s, she was really fighting for consolidation of her land. She was like the biggest farmer. My granddad used to be a teacher. But my grandmother was doing things in society that was not the norm, like, making sure that she's the one who's administering the estate. Like she was really the one who was a chief cultivator. Both of my grandmothers really were quite contrary to the grain at that time. And I can see it even how my parents were raised and my aunties as well. And growing up, I always knew that, I could speak up, I could echo what my sentiments and views are. But when I went to high school is when I realized I was living in a bubble, a very different bubble. I had girls say things like, I can't do X because I'm a girl. I knew the English meaning of that sentence, but I didn't understand what it was. But then I realized it's how I was raised. And I think that's one of the things when I finished high school, I was very intentional to go and mentor girls because I realized how we were raised was not the norm. And I think it's really sad because adolescence is such an impressionable period.
That is true.
And if you get in the kind of wrong messaging, it almost limits it does limit your worldview. I do think having people who can open doors for you, encourage you, speak life to your ideas and your visions is really important, especially for adolescent girls. And I do think I recognize I had that privilege growing up, which is why it's so important to make sure, even if you don't necessarily socialize that way, it's really important that you seek mentors. Because as much as we're saying how we're socialized definitely affects our outlook on life, I do think, especially when you get older, you need to recognize that I can do something, I can change the narrative by actually having my own voice and agency. And that's why I think mentorship comes in, because mentorship tries and opens that worldview for you so that you don't look at life with just that lens that you grew up with. And that's why I think it's so, so instrumental that women have mentorship. I know the statistics you shared at the beginning, it's so sad. They say that 78% of corporations have programs for cross mentorship for women. And even here in Nairobi, you'll notice all these big corporates, you hear people talking about
the mentors or the coaches.
Coaches.
Yeah.
But it's so sad that they say even with 78% of organizations having that, there are very few women who will actually seek a mentor, or there are very few women who will mentor others. And we can talk a bit about why that's the norm. I think sometimes it shocks you when someone comes and says, Nyambura, please be my mentor.
Yeah, that's true.
It's a bit intimidating. It doesn't matter when you read that
responsibility of someone's.
Exactly. And I think it's how also we when you want to take someone under your wings, you really want them to succeed. And sometimes I think we get so scared when someone is approaching you that boldly. And I keep saying the strategy works differently. You have to first know the person. There are some people who I prefer you just come out straight to me and say, I would like you to be my mentor. But for me, I keep saying it has to be like for a definite period. Like I can't be your mentor for
the rest of
perpetuity.
your,
Like
yeah,
I
that's
need to
true.
know, like, let's review this in 1 year, see if it's working. You might have outgrown me, or whatever your skill you're coming to learn has already been achieved.
That's
but it has to be structured. But there are people who especially people I don't know, who reach out that way, and I'm like, I don't really know what I'm signing up for. But I do think we need to be comfortable with seeking out mentors. And I think it's, again, how we're socialized. Women do not necessarily feel confident. And I don't think it's true. I just feel like there are many other baggages we're coming into the space with that we feel we don't want to take people who we don't really know because, but I want that to be the norm. And that's why I keep saying, even if you're mentoring someone, you have to make sure that that person also mentors someone, because I think this is how the magic works. You can't just be a sponge. Even if you dip a sponge into water, at some point the sponge will have to release water. So for mentorship to work effectively, I think you need to mentor and you need to be mentored, so that then we also normalize this thing of stretching an olive branch, asking for help, asking for assistance, and having people cheer you on. I think it's, and I know there are conversations about whether cross-gender mentorship is fine. Again, I think my honest opinion, I think it depends on the context. In spaces, especially when you're looking for a professional skill, I do think it's fine. You know, when you mentioned in my resume, I did my articles at Triple O, and all of my mentors at that time were men, and I think that's fine. But I think you have to be very clear, what is the objective, like what skill are you getting? But for adolescent girls, I honestly think, especially when you're having conversations about SRHR, I think it's problematic that if it's a man meant, and I know there are spaces where you go, the men are talking to the girls about puberty. I just have a bad taste in my mouth, because I feel like that's a conversation they should be hearing from a woman themselves, because then it kind of, I don't want them to pick up innuendos from the language that the man will be using. I think it's important for us to be comfortable having these very candid conversations with girls.
That is true. And it's also that the space of mentorship has been taken advantage of sometimes, in terms of when it's mixed mentorship.
That's true.
But I feel, I just to reiterate what you said, I think the advantages of young girls hearing leadership messages from women. One is because there are very few. For you to visualize yourself as a leader, sometimes you have to see like a person like Wangari Maathai. For the generation that we have, I think most of us envision our leadership journeys depending on how far people like Wangari Maathai went. True. So I think in terms of mentorship, leadership messaging, it's important for women to come forth. And it also applies in terms of debunking the myths of feminist leadership, because I think if we have more women mentoring younger women, one of the advantages of it is it debunks the myth of women are their worst enemies. And some of these things, I know they're deliberate, some are accidental, but I think it's from where I come from. I think we need more women to step up to guide and mentor the younger generation. And I know there's power dynamics sometimes in terms of because leadership in itself is about power. And so even for women, there's a part that feels like you're relinquishing power to the the lower generation, and it feels like there's a strife. So I think in mentorship, these are conversations that people need to have, and I think the work you're doing is great because it creates space for that conversation to continue. I mean, and other people to find other intersections.
I do echo what your sentiment around when you see something, you perceive it, then your chances of believing become quite high. It's a different experience telling a girl you can fly a 787 versus here is Cookie, she flies a 787.
Exactly.
That whole experiential learning completely transforms how we see even our own inhibitions and our greatness. And I do think that's why it's so important for women to give back to especially younger generations, because it completely breaks down barriers that we young women and girls have for themselves when they see someone who has been able to shatter the glass ceiling, if it exists, to be able to occupy those spaces. I also do think it's a really important culture to unlearn those sentiments that women are their worst enemies, and that you going and holding another woman's hand, a young girl's hand, opening spaces for her, completely changes that narrative. And I think we need to make that more the norm than it is. Like, the fact that you are the only woman in a boardroom should really, really behoove you to make sure that when you're leaving that space, you're not the only one. As opposed to saying, because I struggled, every other woman should
struggle. Yes.
We commend these women who've been able to, because I am sure it's really, really difficult to be in those spaces where you're the only woman, and it's very hard to be able to truly be yourself. And I think that's why there's some women leaders who try and change their leadership style, because the space they're influencing, there are no people who look like them.
That is true.
But I think it's really important, beyond you continuously doing what you're brilliant at, to make sure that you're making the space more, like, to have more people who are as inclusive, or to make the spaces as inclusive as possible, and making sure that you're intentional about mentoring and coaching other people in your team, so that when you're leaving, I think the greatest measure of our success is that I didn't just leave, I left, and I left the space better. I think that's what.
That is true.
Yeah.
Because I think I have a friend who's one of my mentors, and one of her policies is that every time she gets into, she's in peace and security, she's a renowned mediator. Every time she steps in a table and sits, she has to carry 3 younger girls.
Yeah.
Or you're not having her.
Yeah.
She knows she has. I mean, because she works with on high level missions.
Yeah.
So she already has the power.
Yeah.
So she leverages that power by saying, if I can't have 3 younger women, I'm not sitting on the table. Which means that by the time she's exiting, the people or the men around the table, or the powers that be around the table, have become familiar of having to deal with 3 younger women. And I think that is a certain way. It's a deliberate, as you said, intentional way of making sure that the gender gaps we keep calling out are actually closed. Because one of the things that I feel is that we keep talking about policy, and that is good, because policy is a big part of change.
True.
But if you're not pointing the powers that be, or people that they are capable younger women, or another generation of women, then they almost shrug their shoulders and say, but where do we hire them from?
True.
But if they're on their faces, no one can ever say, but there was no woman to hire. Because exactly, there were 3 women, there were 4 women. And so I think more women leaders have to be deliberate about, opening doors, as you said, and making sure it's just not opening doors, it's actually making sure that there are more seats than hers.
That's true. That's true. And it's also equipping, because I think one of the things, there are some spaces I've been where you feel, and I know we call it imposter syndrome, but I think it's so, like, it's a very different conversation having this conversation with a man than it is with a woman.
That is true.
Because then I already know I'm competent, I already know I'm qualified, but that, I think, again, mentorship is really important to help you be able to unpack, why am I feeling insecure about this?
That is true.
Because there's some spaces where I felt like I'm the only Black person. I'm the only young person.
Yeah.
And there are all these levels of, perception of what a woman at that age should or should not be doing. But I think mentorship is also important to help you really be vulnerable, and because I think that's one of the things that can, if you don't manage it well, can be your downfall. The fact that you're not managing your own insecurities. And I think it's really important to have a mentor who's also willing to share how you navigate those spaces. One of my mentors told me, before you go for a big speaking conference or a meeting where you feel intimidated, like, go to the bathroom and do a power pose and, like, psych yourself up, like, and I was just like, that's such a small thing, but really impactful. Yeah, because, and she works for Salesforce in San Francisco, and I was just like, wow, the fact that she goes through that, isn't that so? It's comforting that I was like, I'm not the only crazy person, but it's also just her being able to share her own vulnerabilities and tells me this is how I manage it. And so every time I'm like, I remember if I'm nervous, and she also used to tell me, like, notice even people who you think are really good speakers. Like, I think Obama is like an excellent orator. And I remember she was telling me once, like, he will always, like, be touching his cufflinks or his watch.
That is true.
To try and calm himself down. So she was saying, you need to find something that is not so obvious for people to notice that, oh my God, Nyambura is nervous. But it's something that you do to pace yourself. And I was just like, small things like that, you won't read them in a classroom anywhere. A teacher will not tell you.
That's true.
And I think there's some things mentors will tell you because they've gone through that journey.
And they also know you personally.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.